Today we are going to make a quick revision about what we have taken last week. It was about the direct and indirect objects and the types of complements, and we also come across the categories of verbs according to the type of complement and object. So let's start first asking you about this question: what is the difference between direct and indirect object? Yes, yes, Naka, please.
Direct object always comes after the indirect object. Number two, maybe refers to person, thing, or place. Number three, can be object.
Do you sure, Naka, that direct object always comes after the indirect object? Do you sure?
Yeah, but we have an exception.
Yes, we cannot generalize in language. We cannot say always, because for every rule there is such a kind of irregularities. So the indirect object, I agree with you, it precedes the direct objects commonly, but sometimes we can put the indirect object after the direct object and precede it by a preposition. For example? Yes?
Ali sent a message to me.
Ali sent a message to me. That's right. So here the indirect object is after the direct object. And we can say Ali sends me a message. So in this case the indirect object precedes the direct object. Yes guys, what else? Who can tell me more about the direct object? Is it the more frequent kind of object? Yes, please, your name? Yes, Muhammad.
The direct object is a thing, whereas the indirect object is a person.
Yes, that's right. So the direct object is the most or the more frequent kind of object, and it refers to something that you give to a recipient, or there is a receiver who is characteristically a person. I mean, the indirect object is referring to a person who is the recipient, or the one who receives the action or the thing that is done or given to him. Yes, please, your name? Yes, no.
Direct object. The direct object is part of the more frequent kind of object, and the instruction out standing expression must always be present in the if there is an indirect object in that sentence.
Yes, thank you. Yes, any other addition? Yes, Maria? Yes, now let's shift to the complements. How many kinds of complements can be distinguished?
There are two kinds of complements: subject complement and object complement.
Subject complement and object complement.
In
Yes.
case of types subject complement and object complement, there are strength of the relationship between the complement and their example. He is the chairman.
He is the chairman. Yes, so where is the subject complement? The chairman is the subject complement. Yes, Ma'arif. Yes, please. What about the object complement? Why it is called as object complement?
Object complement. They made him the chairman.
Yes, they made him the chairman. Where is the object complement
The
here?
chairman عاد على him.
So why it is called as object complement?
Because it's target for word relationship between the subject and the object, the subject or object related in the pronoun.
It is called as object complement or subject complement because there is a straightforward relationship between the complement and the object in case of object complement, and the complement and the subject in case we are talking about the subject complement. Okay, Now, who can tell me about the kinds of verbs? There are many or different kinds of verbs corresponding closely to the kinds of objects and complements. So now we have 4 kinds, 2 kinds of objects and 2 kinds of complements. So these verbs are corresponding to these kinds of objects and complements. Who can tell me? Yes, your name? Yes, Ms. Never.
Intensive verb وقلنا extensive verb.
Yes, we have intensive verbs
Intensive verb.
and extensive verbs.
verb.
Who can tell me about the intensive verbs? Why do we call it as intensive? What is the definition of intensive verbs? Yes? An intensive verb is the verb that is followed by subject complement. Is the verb that is followed by subject complement. Okay. What about the extensive verbs? Yes, Nada?
Is intensive doesn't bear in mind any of the 4 object complement terms.
The extensive verb, from its name, it can be extended. It can be extended, for example, it may be followed by an object, and we call it, by the way, it is either transitive or intransitive verb. So concerning the intransitive verbs, these kinds of verbs do not permit to any of the 4 object and complements types. Okay? For this reason, we call them as intransitive. For example, it's rained. It rained. So here rained, it is an intransitive verb. But the transitive verbs are of 3 kinds. They are either monotransitive verbs that take only one object. For example, he writes a story. So the story here is an object and it is a direct object. Or they may be ditransitive verbs. Those kinds of verbs take 2 objects, indirect and direct. For example, he writes me a story. Or it may be a complex transitive. It means it has an object and object complement. For example, they made him the chairman. So the chairman is the object complement, okay? Actually, today in the morning, while I was preparing for the lecture of today, I have discovered that I was mistaken. And for the sake of scientific honesty, يعني من أجل الأمانة العلمية, I have to tell you about the mistake that I told you about. Last week, I gave you an example. I was explaining the different kinds of verbs. So I told you to write in your answer, just like this, sentences which have subject complements, and you have to put here a comma and here another comma. So this is incorrect. Why? Because we have 2 kinds of clauses, relative clauses. By the way, any relative clause starts with either one of these relative pronouns. For example, which, or when, or whose, or that, or which, etc. So these are called as relative pronouns. So a relative clause is of 2 kinds. We have 2 kinds of relative clauses. يعني شوف الجمل الوصلية عندنا بيها نوعين. We have either defining, please come here, Mustafa, come here. We have either defining relative clauses. This is the first kind. Defining relative clauses. Defining, it means it defines the subject. It is necessary for the subject. So the first kind of relative clauses is defining, And the second one is non-defining relative clauses. Non-defining. So from its title, these kinds of relative clauses give us additional information, give us extra information about the subject. You see? So if we delete them from the sentence can stand by itself. There's no problem. For example, so again, defining relative clauses are necessary for the subject because they tell us about the subject. Necessary. They give us necessary information about the subject. While non-defining relative clauses, they're optional. So we can omit them or we can delete them. So consider these two examples. Pay attention. Here, sentences which have subject complements. So when you read this sentence, you feel that this is a defining relative clause. So it must be annexed, it must be connected with the subject because we don't know which kinds of sentences. These sentences are not defined, so we need to define them. You see? For this reason, the correct answer is here, down here. Sentences which have subject complements have. So here, sentences which have subject complements, till this point, this is all the subject. You see? And I told you that in the elements of sentences, a subject or an object or an adverbial can have all of these internal constituents or elements of sentences. And here have is the main verb. Have is the main verb. Okay? And this is the sentences which have subject complements have intensive verbs. Okay? This is the complement. Okay. Now let's have a look on the second kind of the relative clauses, which is non-defining. Non-defining relative clauses. For example, interrogative sentences. Interrogative sentences. الجمل الاستفهامية. Here I put a comma, okay, which I have written in my letter. And here there is another comma. This means that this relative clause is what? Is non-defining. Why it is non-defining? Because we can take it away. We can omit it from the sentence and we say interrogative sentences contain question mark. Okay? So I want you to pay attention to this difference between relative clauses. I may ask you in the examination to identify whether the underlined relative clause is a defining or non-defining. The second topic, it is about the aspectual contrast. Aspectual contrast, in a grammar, we use the term aspect to refer to the, to differentiate between two kinds of verbs, whether they are dynamic or stated, whether there is an action in the verb or the verb is stated. There is no action in it. So the first kind, by the way, there is another, these are called as progressive. Progressive, it means يعني تقادمي بفتح حركة, there is a moving in it, and non-progressive يعني كل هاي المسميات إذا قلت لك progressive and non-progressive معناته البروجريسيف فعل ب-ing يعني بحركة يعني حركة دايناميك, والنون-progressive معناته فعل ما بحركة. فإذا أسألك أقول لك what is the difference between progressive and non-progressive verbs, معناتها أنه أنا إذا أريد تحكي لي على الدايناميك والستيتيف verbs, وإذا سألتك على الدايناميك والستيتيف verbs اللي هي هاي هنا, فأنت نفس الشيء هم راح تتطرق لي إلى أن الدايناميك تقول لي تعتبر progressive verbs والستيتيف تعتبر non-progressive verbs. So, classification of verbs according to the aspectual contrast. الأسبكت هي السمة. الأسبكtual contrast يعني التناقض اللي موجود بالأفعال من ناحية سمتها إذا كانت حركية أو غير حركية, of progressive and non-progressive. According to the aspectual contrast, verbs can be classified into dynamic and stative verbs. So we have two kinds. If I ask you a question, for example, classify the verbs according to the aspectual contrast, what is your answer will be? If I ask you to classify verbs according to the aspectual contrast, you have to tell me that there are two kinds of verbs: dynamic, between two brackets, progressive, and stative verbs, between two brackets, non-progressive. Okay? Dynamic verbs are progressive verbs, however, stative verbs are non-progressive verbs. So please pay attention to these two examples. In the first example, John carefully searched the room. So here we have the verb search. When we change it into the past continuous tense, it will be John was carefully searching. John was carefully searching the room. This means that this verb is what? Is a dynamic verb. Why? Because I can change it into the past continuous. And also I can change it into a present continuous. I can say, John is carefully searching the room. Why? If we have a look, so this is correct. Okay? This is correct because it is dynamic verb. While here, John knew the answer. John knew. Here is a past simple tense. John knew the answer. If I want to change it from the past simple into a past continuous, this mark, the asterisk, it refers to the L-form sentences. This means that there is a mistake in the sentence. يعني هذه بالقواعد هاي العلامة اللي مثل النجمة يستخدموها في كتب القواعد حتى يقول لكم إن هاي الجملة خطأ. Okay? John was knowing. Can we say John was knowing? This isn't correct. Why? Because know is a linking verb and we cannot add ing to the verb know. Okay? So please pay attention to these two kinds of verbs, and this is the classification according to the aspectual contrast. Okay, now we're going to talk about the categories of adverbials. Categories of adverbials here at العبارات الظرفية. I told you that adverbials are similar to the adverbs. They can modify a verb, or they can modify an adverb or an adjective, so they are the same. But today we have two different kinds of adverbials that can be distinguished depending on the two types of verbs that we have just explained, whether they are preceded by dynamic verbs or stative verbs. Okay? So here adverbials can be classified according to the type of verb. I may bring you this sentence and put between two brackets discuss. So in this case, I want you to tell me how many kinds of adverbials we have in case we're talking about verbs. I mean the preceding verbs. So they depend on the kind of verb that precedes them. We have two kinds. The first one we call it as, from its name, process adverbials. This is the first kind. Process adverbials. Process adverbials and non-process adverbials. Okay? In the computer, if you have laptops or computers, we have this term, process or processing. It refers to the continuity. It refers to the progression, okay? So from its name of process adverbials, you can feel that these kinds of adverbials are preceded by what? Are preceded by dynamic verbs, okay? So the former and the latter. The former, it means process adverbials, okay? This is a style of writing. we have the former. The former, it means the process adverbials. And the latter, يعني الأخير, it means non-process adverbials. The former is preceded by dynamic verb, and the latter is preceded by a stative verb, for example. So consider this example, please. John searched the room carefully. We can change the adverbial carefully with slowly, and we can change it with noisily. We can change it with sternly or without delay. So whatever adverbial you use, they can be applied here in this sentence. Why? Because the verb search is what? Is a dynamic verb. I can change it into the past continuous and I say John was searching. I can change it into a present continuous and say John is searching for it. Why? These kinds of adverbials, process adverbials cannot be used or cannot be applied here in this sentence which doesn't have a dynamic verb. She is. So here is what?
It's a stative verb.
Yes, it's a stative verb. It's a primary auxiliary and it is a stative verb. She is now a student. Can I say carefully? No, it's L form. Can I say slowly, noisily, sternly, without delay? They cannot. Why? Because these are process adverbials, can be used only with the dynamic verbs. Okay, only with the dynamic verbs. But with the stative verb, I can use non-process adverbials such as now. Now is considered as non-process adverbial because it's used with a stative verb. Is it quite clear for you guys? Have you understood the topic? I hope so. Yes, thank you so much.